fun fictions dictate our actions moving forward. And that's exactly what's happening with wind and solar right now. And we're going to end up like Free Willy unless we kind of shift and pivot our course here. There will be blackouts, and that's just going to happen. And it's going to have to happen, right? In order to get these people that have this kind of Free Willy, feel good environmentalism to reevaluate their priors when it comes to wind and solar. And then maybe they look and say, well, okay, well, let's look at nuclear.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
of course, the world cannot meet it without America,
that is willing to
we're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the job.
Nuclear regulation.
We need scientists to design new fuels.
And focus on net public benefit.
We need engineers to invent new technologies.
Over absurd levels of radiation protection.
Entrepreneurs to sell those technologies.
Then we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech, zero-carbon components.
Unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Okay, welcome back to the Fire Division podcast, where we discuss energy-dense fuels and how they can better human lives. Today we've got Isaac Orr with us, who is a policy fellow for the Center of the American Experiment. Isaac, how you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to your listeners.
Yeah, sometimes we have guests that have expertise that I don't have, and sometimes we have guests that overlap or have antagonizing views, and I feel like I learn something from everyone always, but I suspect that you and I will have similar views on a lot of issues, and so I'm excited to chat with you about your space and where you're coming from. So, Isaac, for our audience's benefit, why don't you give kind of a 30 to 60 second intro on just kind of your background, who you are, and then we can dive into some more of your background and what kind of stuff you're working on.
Yeah, sounds great. So I work at a place called Center of the American Experiment. It's a conservative think tank located in Minnesota, where I do energy and environmental policy. I work a lot with modeling different energy systems with my colleague, Mitch Rolling. We look at mining issues. We look at kind of the whole gambit of, okay, well, how do we have a prosperous, abundant society for people? We're big fans of Norman Borlaug, who was, of course, a graduate of the University of Minnesota. So really, we just try to bring an abundance agenda to the energy and environment space. And I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. So one of my common gripes for anybody who's listening to me on other shows is people think milk comes from the store and they think energy comes from the outlet. So really what I would like, my druthers are, look, we need to get people educated about where things come from. Otherwise, they're going to take it for granted. And by the time they realize that, it's going to be too late. So right now, I'm basically saying, whoa, Nelly, we need to slow some of this stuff down, and we need to actually have a real conversation about this and not just sound bites that are kind of traded back and forth on Twitter.
Gotcha. No, that's really helpful. How long have you been at the Center for the American Experiment, and where were you before?
Yeah, so I've been there for 5 years, going on 6, right? So it'll be just 5 years. Before that, I was at the Heartland Institute for about 4 years. That basically takes me up to when I was an aide in the Wisconsin State Capitol, really just out of college doing like constituent work, which I was not good at. I just didn't have the same passion for that as I did for policy. So I got a little sloppy from time to time. I can admit my own faults, but really what kind of got me into this field in the first place was when I was something like regarding mining permits. There was discussion of legalizing iron mining in Wisconsin. I was writing some pretty good responses to the constituents. So that got me the job of just kind of writing the weekly newsletter for the state senator that I worked for. And then basically, long story short, the president of the Heartland Institute read one of my articles and he's, oh, well, this is great. I'm going to instruct my staff to write like this. And I said, well, I'll do you one better, sir. Why don't you just instruct me to write? And eventually that turned into a freelance opportunity, and they created a position for me after that. So, I've been here ever since.
Nice. That's awesome. So I want to do kind of an overview on the Center, but I do want to focus on you a little bit more and some work that you've done. your handle on Twitter is the fracking guy. There's not a lot of fracking in the state. Well, let me ask, is there much fracking near
Well,
you?
you know the answer to that. There's no oil
Yeah.
and gas deposits in Minnesota. But one of the things that's interesting is I used to live in Wisconsin. That's where I was born and raised, right? But a lot of the sand that they use for hydraulic fracturing comes out of Wisconsin, western Wisconsin. It's the northern white. It's a lot of 100 mesh sand. Before it was, higher mesh when they thought that was better for oil and gas. So I actually started writing a lot about frac sand mining in western Wisconsin because a lot of people there were trying to stop it. Some people were just legitimately concerned about potential environmental impacts. Other people saw it as a way to starve the oil and gas industry of the supplies that they need in order to expand production. So I wrote a series of 6 papers with my friend Mark Hinaman, who's a geologist at GZA Geo Consulting down in Milwaukee. And that kind of got me interested in it. But then after that, my first foray into this was explaining what hydraulic fracturing is and why it's awesome. And I went to school for political science and geology at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And that kind of helped me understand the jargon in the scientific journals and stuff like that. And it helped me like translate that to average person, right? My friend
Yeah.
Abby she went to school for mechanical engineering at Madison. And one of her favorite jokes is like, what's an engineer's most effective form of birth control? It's like their personality, right? So sometimes engineers can try to go into a situation and alleviate concerns that normal people have, normies have, and walk away kind of instilling less certainty rather than more certainty in that situation.
I
So
a
one of the
huge
things
victim of that. Yeah.
yeah. So one of the things I just try to do is I try to boil this down into a way that normal people can understand the risks and opportunities and feel good about it.
Nice. I'm curious on the Wisconsin Northern White sand. I mean, on the show, right, we say energy dense fuels, meaning we love nuclear. We think that's best. It's the most energy dense, but kind of second or third place is oil and gas. And so it's interesting to talk about those topics too. And certainly our background comes from that. So a lot of people moved away from the Northern White sand, at least in the Permian Basin. They used to rail this in across the country because they thought it was better, higher crush strength. And was that impactful on Wisconsin and reducing the demand for that product?
Oh yeah,
Or did
like
you
in
ask maybe I'll ask the question differently. Did you have exposure to that and what was the impact?
I mean, I didn't have personal exposure or financial exposure to it really, but
Sure.
like I went to school in western Wisconsin, so it was good to see the economic activity that sand mining was generating over there, right? So it has been tougher for those northern white producers now that there's a lot of like in basin sand being used in Texas, right?
Mhm.
A lot of those same companies are setting up sand mines in Texas in order to serve that local need. But when you look at the cost of railing that sand from Wisconsin down to Texas, it was a
It's
big
expensive.
expense.
Yeah.
It was very expensive, right? It's a heavy commodity, right? It does have great crush strength. It's got good, the sphericity is good. There's a lot to like about Northern White, and that's why it's still used a lot in places like North Dakota or other shale basins that don't have a good enough supply of sand, right? Nobody says like the Texas sand is as good as Northern White, but it's cheaper and it's closer. And the permeability of this sand is greater than the shale, so they do it, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's fine, right?
Importantly, well results or the production results were not noticeably different long term. So okay, so Center of the American Experiment. What is this group? It's a think tank, conservative think tank, but what kind of issues do you guys focus on? What are some of the big issues that you're addressing right now? Yeah, give us some perspective.
Yeah, for sure. So we kind of run the gambit, right? I've carved out an energy and environment niche for myself, but we have 2 economists on staff. We have a public safety fellow. Basically, he was a detective for Hennepin County, which is like the biggest county in Minnesota. It includes Minneapolis, talking about rising crime rates. How do we alleviate some of that, which is a real problem that's happening all over the country. We have an education fellow who talks about, look, we're spending a lot of money, but our test scores are going down. How do we try to reverse this trend? So, and then we have a healthcare fellow as well. So, really, we kind of run the whole gambit of, okay, well, what's an optimal tax policy to retain businesses and encourage new ones to start up? So, you name it, we've probably covered it.
Gotcha. So talk to us a little bit about the energy work that you guys are doing? What are some of the key issues that you're focused on?
Yeah, for sure. So Mitch Rolling and I have come up with our own in-house modeling stuff that we've done for the last 5 years. It's become a lot more sophisticated over that 5 year time, which is good because if you're not growing, you're atrophying, right? So basically what we do is we model the cost of different was legislation, right? So if we had a 100% carbon-free electricity mandate that got passed here in Minnesota. We modeled the cost of that. The governor of Wisconsin was advocating for a very similar policy, but he was going to try and do it through executive order. So we modeled the cost of that. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars more than is currently being spent on the electric grid between now and 2050 in both of those proposals. I think it was 313 in the case of Minnesota and only 250 or something of that nature in Wisconsin because they wanted to meet that goal by 2050 instead of 2040, right? So we look at that kind of stuff. We've worked with other organizations in other states in integrated resource planning, right? We evaluate, okay, so Duke in North Carolina had their basically they wanted to decarbonize on similar time scale as Excel. They had 4 plans, and we evaluated each of those plans, what it was going to cost the customer, and then we offered a lower cost alternative that's still decarbonized. And no surprises, it's mostly nuclear power because it's always on, right? So, and
Yeah.
ultimately, that's one of the things that we try to stress to people. There are a lot of people out there that talk about the levelized cost of energy, and it's usually wind and solar advocates who do this, and they'll cite Lazard, right? Because they're pretty
It's a
um,
total garbage report.
well, so here's the thing. I don't think the report is garbage. I think the context in which the renewable advocates are using that report is garbage, right?
There you
Because
go.
on
Yeah,
page
that's
one
the right
of
way to
that
say it.
report, on page one of the report, it says this does not account for the fact that you need more transmission for renewables. That's not factored into our cost analysis. You don't need to, we do not factor in the cost of providing reliable electricity all of the time using renewables, right? So what they're doing is they're taking some of the most charitable assumptions that you can use for a wind project or a solar project and telling you what the cost of that one atomized facility would be if it were operating under these parameters. And it is the wind and solar advocates who say, see, wind and solar is lower cost than all of these other sources, but they're not incorporating the additional utility profits that accompany any new infrastructure, right? If you built a new power plant, nuclear plant in the state of Minnesota, the utility that built it would be making billions of dollars in profit on top of that. That's just the way it works. It's the
Yeah.
cost of service regulation, right? So, but the thing is, like, you get to spend a lot more money on wind, solar, and battery storage than you would on a nuclear power plant because I think as NREL says, battery storage facilities only last 15 years. That's what they're modeling. Wind facilities last up to 20. We've had experience in Minnesota where Xcel Energy, which is the largest utility investor owned in Minnesota, is repowering facilities after 8 years, 9 years, 12 years, right? So halfway through their lives, they're basically entirely refurbishing these assets. And that's mostly to requalify for federal subsidies, right? But how does it make sense to evaluate the cost of an asset over 20 years when realistically it's only operating for 10, right? These are the arguments that we make in the publications that we put out. So long term, this nuclear power plant's going to last for 80 years, maybe longer, right? And it's ultimately going to provide the highest value for the ratepayer, but it's not going to provide the highest value for the shareholder. And therein lies the rub. That's why you have all of these utilities talking about how they're going to increase their wind, solar, and battery storage facilities and maybe use nuclear on the margins, right? And it's because wind and solar and batteries are perpetual cash machines for the utilities, and their shareholders are going to love it. So we just try to call balls and strikes on that sort of stuff. And when necessary, try to embarrass people for their bad ideas.
Yeah. So cost analysis for Minnesota and Wisconsin. Have you guys ever considered doing something for Colorado? I mean, I know you work with Excel or Excel covers that territory, but covers
Yeah,
Colorado too.
we're working with the Independence Institute right now on that, actually. So we finished our report. We looked at, okay, so what would it cost to retire Comanche 1, 2, and 3? I believe there's a big coal plant out in Craig, Colorado, and then also replace the natural gas by 2040, which I think is what Polis is looking to do out there. And what would it take to replace that with wind, solar, and battery storage? And boy, howdy, is it expensive. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. But we also look at the cost of a few other proposals out there, which is really cool because this is a new thing that we've done. We looked at the cost of electrifying home heating out there. So we were able to get the hourly natural gas consumption from the Colorado Springs utilities, because they're a municipal utility and they have to give you their data through an open records request. Even though they're not happy, they have to do it. So we were able to get the hourly natural gas demand. We converted that into megawatt hours, accounted for the fact that a furnace isn't as efficient as like an electric resistance heater. So we could have an hourly electricity profile for home heating and figure out, okay, so what's the peak capacity that you would need in order to essentially deliver the same amount of heat via wind, solar, and battery storage and for home heating. And we even did it with heat pumps. So we went out, we found one of the most efficient heat pumps. We used the assumptions for the Mitsubishi Hyperheat. It was rated the best cold weather heat pump for, I think it was Carbon Switch is the website. And I called a few technicians. I had them like come out to my house and tell me like everything I needed to know about this thing. So I did my homework on it. And then we actually took the hourly temperature for Colorado Springs and compared that to what the coefficient of performance or the efficiency of the heat pump would be in order to actually have an hourly power draw that you would have. And the thing about a heat pump like that is they cut out at -13. Like they just stop working at -13. And that's not such a big deal if you're in Texas and like you only have those temperatures like once every 20 years, but it's really bad when you do have it because you're not ready for it. But in a cold weather climate like Minnesota, then you're SOL, right? It's just not going to be good enough. You're going to need some sort of resistance heat, which has it does not have a huge efficiency gain over a natural gas furnace, or at least enough to make it worthwhile, right? Plus, electricity is way more expensive than natural gas. So why would you ever do that? It doesn't make sense from a cost perspective. And then we looked at also like hourly electric vehicle charging data in order to say, look, we've decarbonized the home heating sector, the light duty vehicle sector, and we've also decarbonized the electric grid. And I think the final numbers are over 600 billion through 2050. Like it's pretty wild. And I don't have these, they're not in a report that's published, so I don't want to spoil too much, but it's a really cool report and I encourage you to check it out when it's available.
What's the timeline on that, when it might be released?
Well, we sent them the finished slides 2 days ago, and this is being recorded on St. Patrick's Day. So I don't know. I really don't know what the final is. It's going to be a lot of work to put that into a readable format, but look for that in the next quarter or so, I would hope.
Perfect. Well, hopefully we'll see when we actually release this. So hopefully by the time we do, the report's out and live, or potentially when we do release it, we'll just have you back on. You can walk us through it.
Sure.
So while you were chatting, I did pulled up slide 1 on the Lazard report just to call attention to this, which I just find this to be so crazy. They say other factors could have potentially significant effects on the results contained herein. These include capacity value versus energy value, transmission costs, significant permitting or development cost of complying with environmental regulations, example carbon emissions offsets. It's just like all of the things that go into a real energy system.
Yeah.
To actually make energy work, right? They're like, oh, we're just ignoring all this. So anyway, just calling attention to that. The American experiment, it sounds like a relatively small team. I guess, is that true? You listed a couple of different departments and fellows that you guys have, but
yeah, it's probably like 15 to 20, like full and part-time people. I'd have to sit and count like whose office is where in order to come up with an exact number. But yeah, it's a relatively small organization.
Then think tanks. I mean, you guys aren't a nonprofit, but I guess how's that structured? And how
we're a
Is it through
nonprofit.
donations? Can people
Anybody
make donations? And
yeah. So we're a nonprofit organization. So if you want to listen or make a donation after listening to this podcast, listener, it is tax deductible, right? So We're funded by thousands of Minnesotans. I think it was like 8,000 people. Our median donation is like $50.
Wow.
So we're truly a grassroots organization, right? Not some people write bigger checks than that, obviously, but yeah, so it helps when we get out there, and a lot of think tanks just like to just kind of write their report and hope that it gets picked up. But we do a lot of like guerrilla marketing just because we know that the other side outspends us like 10 to 1. So, and 10 to 1 would be a generous ratio, honestly. So we do billboards, we do radio ads, we do a lot of like tours. We'll like go out and give talks to local service clubs all over the state of Minnesota. So I've got to go do one tomorrow on a Saturday, which is a bummer, but I grew up on a dairy farm, so there's way worse things I could be doing on a Saturday, right? In terms of the work. So,
Yeah.
that's all right with me. But yeah, so that's it. So that's where we get the majority of our funding, and yeah, it's good work.
Nice. I'm curious on nuclear specifically. Why is this a partisan issue? I'm so confused by it. And I don't know, maybe you can help educate me about why the Republicans have picked it up and it's more on the Republican side. Because I mean, I've been studying nuclear for years now, and it's not been obvious to me in all of my studies that based on the merits of the technology, notwithstanding it provides reliable, dependable energy, would be, yeah, supported by just Republicans. Like the fact that it's clean and carbon free should be touted by people that share the climate change agenda wholeheartedly. I'm just so confused by this.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that there's just like a lot of institutional and reflexive anti-nuclearism on the left from kind of like the boomers, right? Like my folks are boomers, but they're Republican boomers, right? So like they're like, well, nuclear is probably fine, but like we've also got this coal plant. So as long as the power's on, I kind of don't mind where it comes from. But there was a lot of association with the bomb, frankly, right? I think Michael Schellenberger does a good job of talking about this in Apocalypse Never, just kind of going through the reasons why people don't like nuclear. Jane Fonda didn't help anything. So there's still a pretty big constituency of that. And I think that younger Democrats, younger liberals are a lot more open-minded to nuclear than the older ones, but the boomers are still running the show in many respects. So that's going to be something that's going to be, I don't think that they're going to let that go easily. I think there's also this kind of pervasive belief that wind, solar, and battery storage will be able to produce as much power as we need more affordably than nuclear, which is wild. It hasn't been observed anywhere it's been tried, right? They basically have very expensive power, and then eventually, if they push it far enough, it ends in blackouts. So there's been a very real reluctance to kind of come to Jesus when it comes to, okay, well, are these energy systems that we've been promoting for the last 20 or 30 years, are they working for us or are they not working for us? And I think it was Mark Twain said it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. And I think we're in that stage right now. There's a lot of ego protection that's probably happening on the left. Some people are a little bit more open to saying, hey, yeah, you know what? I think I was wrong, but it's not an easy thing to do. So yeah, in the meantime, we're just trying to educate as many Minnesotans as possible. We're nonpartisan, we're conservative or free market, but we're not partisan. So whenever a group comes and asks me to talk to them about this stuff, I say, well, yeah, like there's trade-offs for everything. Like nothing is perfect. There's an environmental impact from everything, whether that's a new manufacturing plant, a nuclear power plant, or tourism, right? So it's interesting. So Minnesota has some of the largest undeveloped deposits of copper and nickel in the entire world. We have more cobalt than any other state in the country. But a lot of the same people who are pushing for 100% carbon-free electricity mandates are also vehemently opposed to mining the copper, nickel, cobalt that would be needed for the wind turbines and solar panels that they want to put everywhere. So there's a big disconnect, and I think Robert Bryce does a good job of highlighting this rural urban divide. And it goes back to you have this affluent class that just doesn't know where stuff comes from, or they don't care. So they actually say, oh, well, you know what, in Minnesota, that's where the copper nickel deposits are. You shouldn't want mining. You should be enjoying, you should be promoting the tourism industry. And, those jobs are way lower paid than mining jobs. You can get a mining job that pays you 90 grand out of high school, right? That is a real job that gives you the opportunity to build generational wealth, buy a house, put your kids through college. Like that's the American dream right there. And like they're saying, no, you shouldn't have that job scoop my ice cream when I come up from like
Yeah.
Memorial Day to Labor Day. And nothing makes me angrier than that. As somebody who grew up in rural Wisconsin, we're only 3 hours away from Illinois in that part. So we get a lot of like Chicago people up on the weekends and they spend a lot of money in town, but we also have to deal with the attitude that comes along with that. And there's like this kind of gross paternalism that comes with people that make their money in white collar jobs and they don't really appreciate the necessity of the blue collar jobs. And unfortunately, there's a lot of that. And it's not just isolated to Minnesota or Chicago, right? I feel like the coasts also kind of feel that way about the Midwest.
Absolutely. Let's zoom in on the mining piece a little bit because I find that fascinating. I've had the same conversation, and it's actually been on a podcast where I asked the deputy director of Colorado's energy office if we need more renewables, why don't we have more mining in Colorado to support that supply chain? And her response was, well, minerals have to be there. But in this circumstance, just like you said, there's large deposits of minerals that would be relevant for this energy transition. I'll put that in quotes for, as many people understand it or think it should occur. Why do you think this hypocrisy exists? Is it strictly ignorance and people ignoring it? Yeah, kind of give me your thoughts on why it exists and then how we might remedy that and fix it.
So I just think that the money is good for these NGOs, right? So the Minnesota
Meaning
Center
people
for
believe it because the NGOs that are promoting these ideas spread the gospel that we can build everything on renewables and batteries and that'll be good enough, but then totally ignore, hey, these have to be mined somewhere and we're going to pillage the earth to do
Well,
it.
there's that aspect, but there's also the fact that the NGOs raise a lot of money off of help us stop polymet or this copper nickel mine, and we're going to save Minnesota from like acid mine drainage everywhere. So that's like a big source of their funding is scaring people about the risks of copper nickel mining, right? The other source of their funding is scaring people about climate change and saying, oh, well, if we don't pass this 100% carbon free electricity bill that doesn't lift Minnesota's ban on new nuclear power plants, then your grandchildren aren't going to have a good world to live in, right? So they have this kind of dichotomy where like their funding sources are kind of schizophrenic, right? On the one hand, they get paid a lot of money in donations to fight mining projects. On the other hand, they also get paid a good amount of money to promote wind, solar, and battery storage. So, like to them, they try to reconcile this by saying, oh, well, we can just recycle our way into a circular green economy. And it's no, that's just not how it works. Everyone who calculates the amount of wind, solar, and battery storage capacity that you need for this is going to tell you that you need to drastically increase the amount of mining that's occurring. And if you don't do it in the United States, where we have strong environmental protections, and more than anything, we're affluent enough to care about the environment, right? I'm a big believer in the Kuznets curve, which basically says as you start off developing as a society, right, you don't care very much about the environment because you just want to put food on your table and you want a roof over your head. As you become more affluent, and you have a stable source of income, you have a stable source of food, then environmental protection becomes a higher priority for you, right? Like it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As long as your base is satisfied, then you are going to aspire to bigger and better aspirations, right? So then at some point in your development, you hit a point where you've basically peaked in terms of your environmental degradation per unit of GDP. And after that, you go down. It follows a bell curve for the listeners, right? So I think that's right. But in developing countries where a lot of this mining is going to happen, they're on the front end of that bell curve, whereas we're on the back end. So we have the means in order to have responsible mining here in the United States. Is it going to be perfect? No, nothing is, but it's going to be a hell of a lot better than anything that happens in the DRC or Venezuela.
Great answer. So, I mean, just addressing it truthfully, like you did. So, you guys strike me as pragmatic. You mentioned that many of your analyses of how to get to net zero includes nuclear. I assume that you don't have some religious affiliation with the technology or really liking it for irrational reasons. Why are you guys so pragmatic about it? And what do you like about it? Nuclear specifically?
Well, actually, Mark, that's not true. I really like Ninja Turtles, and I'm hoping that someday we can recreate that. And that's what my pro-nuclear advocacy is based in. No, but in
Me too.
seriousness, right?
Yeah, I loved it as a
Yeah,
kid.
isn't that everybody's reason? That's the closeted
Yeah.
reason behind all of this is the Ninja Turtles. But yeah, that's exactly right, Mark. So we like nuclear power, but that's not to say that we think everything should be nuclear tomorrow, right? Or that we should be rushing headlong into that because that has its own potential problems. So when we talk about our lower cost decarbonization scenarios in our reports, that's just what we call them. That's our nuclear scenario generally. We say, look, we have these existing coal plants, these existing natural gas plants, and they're good assets, and we should be utilizing them until they can't run anymore, right? My dad farms with Ford tractors, and Ford hasn't built a tractor since the 1960s. So I am a big fan of utilizing an asset that you've paid for until you can't use it anymore, right? Like, why waste it? And in that regard, if you want to plan for nuclear power in the future to replace some of those coal plants, reuse a lot of that same infrastructure, that's cool. I'm all right with that. And the reason that we support nuclear at American Experiment and why I support it personally is I do think it's the only technology that will be able to be better or lower cost than coal or natural gas in the future in the long run, right? So when you look at the energy density of nuclear power, you've got like a AAA battery's worth of uranium that produces as much power as half a ton of coal, something like that. So that is a huge opportunity to have a more efficient economy, lower cost electricity, and that's going to be good for everybody. So that's where I think the promise of nuclear power is. Let's see if that develops and let's do what we can to make sure that it does. But until then, like I don't see any point in throwing out these reliable generators that we already have.
So I want to touch on affordability and then get your views on how we can potentially build more. So the affordability piece, hyper important. I mean, and when I talk to opponents or people that are skeptical of nuclear power, often they say, well, notwithstanding waste and the technical challenges and public opinion, at the end of the day, it's just more expensive. How or why is nuclear cheaper, or should it be cheaper? And why is that better than some of the alternative generation sources that we have?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, we look at this in our report. So if you look at, I think it's figure 16 in our Minnesota report, we look at the cost of running a grid on 100% wind solar battery storage with about 20% of Minnesota's existing nuclear fleet still contributing to that. And when you're looking at those additional costs that Lazard doesn't look at, you have basically, we want to look at what is the cost to serve load, right? You have this demand. What's the cost of electricity to serve that demand with different energy resources? So that includes transmission, additional property taxes, because you have more property to tax, right? Utility profits, I may have said that already, then battery storage, and then you have these insane overbuilding and curtailment regimes because everybody realizes that battery storage is cost prohibitive. So what they say is, well, let's just build way more wind and solar than we need, and that will make sure that we have enough electricity when it's cloudy out or it's not very windy, and we can just turn it off or curtail it when it's very windy or very sunny, right? So that adds a lot of cost to the grid. It's redundant capacity that's not doing a whole lot. So we figured out that it would cost about $272 per megawatt hour to serve load with wind and about $472 with solar under the assumptions that we used, right? So we also look at the APR 1400, which is the Korean nuclear reactor. We like that one because it tends to get built on budget and on time, like in the United Arab Emirates. And that one starts out at about $70 a megawatt hour when you build it new. And over time, that cost goes down because the plant gets paid off. You're paying fewer utility profits on that plant. So it gets down to like, I think the first one in our model gets built in 2034 or 2035, and it's down to like $60 a megawatt hour by 2050. But if you were to kind of push that out, let's look at the entire cost of this APR 1400 After 30 years, you're probably looking at city below $40 a megawatt hour. That's just how a depreciated asset like that runs over time, right? It just has fewer overhead capital costs it needs to pay off, fewer other expenses. You have maintenance, obviously. That's really what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about the long term, but the way that utilities make money, and they're always trying to appease shareholders at quarterly meetings, is basically the exact opposite of what the ratepayer ultimately wants and needs, which is low cost electricity so they can use as much as they want and not have to do some like ghoulish demand response regime, right? So we're big fans of nuclear when it comes to building new stuff. Like, sure, look at that, but it's also got to compete with gas. So, like, let's figure
Yeah.
it out.
Yeah, the utility system just feels so perverse, just like you said, Gunther. They're incentivized to build more, and it has to be on all the time, and that's just super expensive. So I like your guys' system, Kaufman. I'll dive into your model and some of the numbers after our conversation. Should have done it before, but alas, life gets in the way. But yeah, the over $250, $270 megawatt hour for wind, over $400 a megawatt hour for solar. That's fascinating versus you said 70 to and dropping $70 per megawatt hour for nuclear. And that's because, I mean, nuclear essentially solves all problems. It can be on when you need it. It's deployable, dependable. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you don't have to build 7x the capacity of your peak load with nuclear. You can get away with having a 10% reserve margin instead of a 700% reserve margin. That's just how it works, right? Like sometimes wind is producing a lot of power, but sometimes it's hardly producing anything. So we look at hourly data from the US Energy Information Administration for MISO, Mid-Continent Independent Systems Operator. It is the regional grid for the Midwest, essentially 15 states. And all of the wind on MISO, so there was a period in January of 2020 where there was an 80-hour wind drought, right? So all of the wind in this 15 state footprint was producing less than 10% of its installed capacity. And for 42 straight of those hours, it was below 1.5% of its potential output. So virtually zero. And this isn't like a polar vortex or anything where they actually have to shut the wind turbines down at negative 22 to prevent them from changing themselves, right? This is just like normal weather. This is a wind drought that just happened to happen. So you have to plan around that, right? So you have to plan around your peak electricity demand, but you also have to plan around these troughs that happen with wind and solar for no reason other than the weather changed, right? So there's just a lot of chaos, as BF Randall would say, in the system now, and managing that is expensive.
Yeah, makes sense. And yeah, those troughs and the variability has been fantastic for the natural gas industry.
Oh, for sure.
Spiking
For
demand.
sure.
It's really good for them.
Well, I mean, there's a reason Aubrey McClendon was giving money to the Sierra Club for the Beyond Coal campaign, right?
Yeah.
He wanted that market share and he got it eventually. He's not around to enjoy it. But yeah, I mean, the natural gas industry loves wind and solar because it gives them basically a monopoly on balancing that load, or so they thought, right? Now, in Colorado, I believe the environmentalists are eating the gas industry. And to that, I would say, told you so. Like, those guys thought that they had it all figured out and they were so smart and they were going to get rid of coal and balance with gas and they were going to line their pockets. And now it's, well, you can import your gas from Wyoming, guys, because Colorado's not going to let you drill it here. So,
baffling. When you
well,
look at the state
is it?
usage of gas. No, it's not baffling, but I meant it's amazing given the utility generation balance. Meaning, if you look at any of the conversations with Excel, and they have to publish these, right? But between the governor and Excel, or the energy office and Excel, it's all, hey, are we going to have enough gas? Do we have enough gas? Is there enough gas? So let's skip to or pivot to deployment of new nuclear, more nuclear. You guys model that it would be a good thing if we want to decarbonize. It helps cost, but how do we actually do it? Pretty
That's a
open-ended
great
question. So yeah,
Well,
you
and
can
it's a great
pick
question.
two
And
or
I
three
don't
of your
know.
favorite points.
Yeah, I don't know if I know the answer to that, frankly. I think that the whole tech idea where you're going to be putting in small modular reactors at existing coal sites, right? I think DOE is looking into that. That's probably a pretty good idea. Like, why not reuse a lot of the same equipment that you already have at a coal plant when that equipment is ready for prime time? I think that's a great idea. I think coal is great. I think that basically the regulations that have forced us to shut down a whole bunch of coal plants over the last 15 years were a massive mistake. We are basically paying the price for that now in terms of higher utility bills and less reliability. I mean, Winter Storm Elliott proved that, right? Very recently, PJM didn't have an PJM almost had to initiate blackouts, and everyone thought PJM had way more capacity than they needed. But when your pipeline delivery system isn't working and you're relying on just in time gas to produce just in time electricity and relying on imports, then you've got Meredith Angwin's fatal trifecta. And that's a really bad situation to be in. So the on-site fuel storage that comes with nuclear, that comes with coal, is valuable. It has not been adequately valued in energy markets for the last 15 years. We had an onslaught of terrible EPA regulations that were mostly from the Obama administration that are now fomenting blackouts. So we're in a real reliability pickle. And the first thing we need to do is stop digging. And to the extent that you can replace a coal plant with a nuclear plant, cool, do it. I'm fine with that. Don't do it prematurely, right? Make sure the technology is ready for prime time. Honestly, like, this is a question for 5 years from now, 8 years from now, mostly, because like you have all of these cool small modular reactor technologies that are still paper reactors, right? They haven't demonstrated anything yet. I mean, they're cool in theory, but in reality, I kind of have a hard time like saying like anything other than let's keep an eye on this technology moving forward and see if it works. If you wanted to have an APR 1400 replace a coal plant, I guess I'm cool with that. I guess I'd rather like the use of natural gas for generation first, right? Because like especially in a cold weather climate like Minnesota, we are seeing higher home heating bills now. And part of that's because we're burning more gas for electricity generation and not just saving it for home heating purposes. So we are stressing our electric grid, well, and our natural gas delivery system because we're trying to make one fuel do too many jobs, right? It's like natural gas is a great tool, but it's not the best tool for every job. Let's keep some of that high value city generation space for nuclear and coal, and then kind of like let consumers enjoy the dividend of that through lower heating costs. So yeah, if that's practical, then I'm practical.
Nice. Given nuclear's long build time or lead time, you mentioned 5 years might be an appropriate timing, but wouldn't it be prudent to start now?
Well, yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
the
if it's
best
going to
time to
take five,
start
10
building a
years to build.
nuclear power plant was 20 years ago. The next best time is like tomorrow, theoretically. But I think people are rightfully spooked about what happened at Georgia, right? Like, have we kind of done an autopsy of those plants? No, because they're not online yet, right? Let's figure out where people messed up. And clearly they messed up because it went a lot longer and it cost a lot more than it was supposed to. Like, I don't think that that's a reason to never build an AP 1000 in the United States again, but let's have a good hard look at where we screwed up and where we can prevent that in the future. And maybe that's a conversation for 2 or 3 years. Look at what happens in other countries where they're building that. Where can we take best practices and bring that back over? But to, to act like there's no risk on the upside of the cost curve is, I think, whistling past the graveyard with nuclear. So I think it's a bit higher value than doing wind, solar, and battery storage. I do, but like the country's got some stuff they need to figure out, and a lot of it's just like nuts and bolts. So come to me
Yeah.
with an answer, and then I'll say, okay, sure. Like, but who wants to be the early adopter for something that just had a pretty bad track record here in the United States? So that's why I think the APR 1400 is cool. Like, they're putting a new one on every year over in the United Arab Emirates. So if you had a contractor like that and they had some certainty from the NRC that they wouldn't have their designs changed around halfway through the build, cool, let's try it. Let's have a shining example of how this can work, but let's be realistic about it.
It sounds like there's an opportunity here for maybe a think tank to write a paper or report and do a postmortem on comparison between Vogtle, right, the plant you mentioned in Georgia, and then the UAE projects, and contrast them and say this one costs this much, this one costs this much, and really identify the differences and how the industry might apply those learnings here in the US.
Yeah, it sounds like a great idea.
I'll be looking for that on your guys' agenda. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Isaac, we've kind of coming up on our time. I guess in closing, I'll ask you to leave us on an optimistic note. Where do you see the energy industry specifically going, call in the next 5, 10 years? Are things changing? What gives you optimism for the future?
Well, I think for the next 5 or 6 years, we're going down the tubes, Mark. That's where we're
We
going.
got to change it. We got to pivot, right? That's fine.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
But like people don't think that there's a problem yet. And at least, or they can't identify what the problem is, right? So you have this very comfortable class in the white collar jobs, and they think that this is good, right? Oh, yeah, we're going to wind and solar. This is great. But they don't want to really think about it beyond that, right? So it's kind of like recycling. Recycling is total bullshit. Unless it's metal, don't do it because it's a waste of energy and it's a waste of money. But people throw all kinds of crap in the recycling that they shouldn't because they want it to be recyclable, right? Same kind of idea here. Like I have this theory that it's free willy environmentalism. Do you remember that movie with the whale that from like 1993? I know this is going to be like purely a millennial thing, but after that movie, all these kids wrote the producers and said, well, we should actually free the whale. And so they tried. This whale had been captured when it was 2 years old. It was in a tank in Canada for a while. Then it got sent down to Mexico, where it was in a tank that was way too small for a full grown killer whale. And it was like, it wasn't even in salt water, it was in a freshwater pen with chlorine. So it was like not a healthy animal. And then they're like, okay, well, let's rehabilitate this whale that's been in captivity for 20 years. So they did 3 years of trying to train this whale to be a whale. And within 3 years of releasing it, no, it was actually like 2 years of releasing it, the whale died because it didn't know how to be a whale in the wild. But we let these like fun fictions dictate our actions moving forward. And that's exactly what's happening with wind and solar right now. And we're going to end up like Free Willy unless we kind of shift and pivot our course here. So, but there will be blackouts, and that's just going to happen. And it's going to have to happen, right? In order to get these people that have this kind of Free Willy, feel good environmentalism to reevaluate their priors when it comes to wind and solar. And then maybe they look and say, well, okay, well, let's look at nuclear. We're willing to accept some of the risks that come with over budget on a project or having it take longer because we understand that it's a long-term practical move, but we're not there yet. And it's going to take people's, well, basically the hard hammer of reality smashing people's misconceptions about this. And that sucks because it's always the people who can least afford a blackout that are hurt the most by it, right? So, and the prices also go up on the way to the blackout. So this is, it's the comfortable class just kind of having maybe rational ignorance, right? Like it's not their fault that the lights have always come on, so they've never had to think about this before. So they kind of let stupid ideas become their preferred narrative, but eventually there's going to be collateral damage, and until it's them, they're not going to care.
Yeah. Well, what I heard is it's going to get worse before it gets better, but hopefully after it gets worse, it will get better.
Oh yeah, you wanted an optimism, didn't you? Sorry, I didn't
Well,
exactly
before you
dial
say
that
the
up.
optimism thing, I do love the whale analogy. Let's highlight this a little bit, even for nuclear adoption. It's almost like we've got this boomer class that was terrified of the bomb, and they're never going to be able to be rehabilitated, to speak, to live in a world that
Like Free
nuclear is
Willy,
okay.
yeah.
So we just have to expose them to it, and then once they pass and their time in power is over, then the people that grow up as whales in this progressive nuclear world will be more comfortable with it and can actually survive in it. But that's fun metaphor. So dual purpose. All right.
Yeah.
So optimism. Yeah. I'm gonna force you to leave us on a high note.
Well, I mean, what was it? Winston Churchill said the Americans always do the right thing after they try all the wrong ones. It'll happen. We'll get our fingers slammed in the door enough times and we'll pull our heads out of our rears. But like until then, it's not going to be fun. So eventually, like the dark ages lasted for a long time, right? I don't think it's going to last that long. There's going to be a course correction because there has to be.
I love it. Okay. Isaac Orr, Policy Fellow for the Center of the American Experiment. It's been fantastic to chat with you. Thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Mark.